Thank you everyone for coming. This is lovely. This is the second feed that we've done. The last one we did was a few years ago with Young Jean Lee's Lear at Soho Rep, which was delightful. I don't know, I just wrote, keeping with the spirit of Nature Theater of Oklahoma's durational events, this pre-show will be approximately 7 hours in length with no intermission. We will wear silly costumes and dance to funky hits from the 70s and serve you peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Anyway.
We should ask how many people have seen.
Yes, how many people have seen our shows?
Yeah.
Nature Theater. Poetics, Ballet Brut.
No dice.
No Dice.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Romeo and
Long-time
Juliet.
listeners.
Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, fewer people. Interesting.
So?
Interesting. Okay.
Not all their shows are.
Anything going back before?
Rambo Solo, right.
Rambo Solo,
yeah.
good. Lance and Lena. That's just me.
Whoa.
I know. Thank you. Okay.
They've been around. I mean,
Was that perhaps in Austria?
Nine, it was at CSC.
Yes.
Yes, so a relationship started between CSC and the
Right.
Columbia directors because they were coming down at the invitation of, was it Brian Kulick who was bringing them down?
Might
I
have
assume
been.
so.
Yeah.
And
There've been a lot of
so,
Brians there.
and there, it's so true. And there's it was actually very startling because you went expecting to see student work and instead it was the first thing that I ever saw by Nature Theater of Oklahoma, which was very exciting. So David, will you tell us? Yeah.
what?
Ask me.
No, go ahead.
No, I
Ask
actually.
him.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Jeffrey, will you tell us a little bit about the Inception in Nature Theater of Oklahoma?
Helen, I'm so glad that you asked me that. And have we ever met before?
We haven't.
Well,
Not-
actually,
not
I mean,
before this
I'm kind of zinging you, but in fact, somewhere in all the material that is available to you, there is a pretty wonderful interview in Bomb magazine conducted by Young Jean Lee with Kelly Copper and Pavel Lishka, who are collectively the heads of, or whatever, of Nature Theater of Oklahoma. And they talk about the first showing of their first piece, the earliest version of Poetics, which was, they say it was at Tonic. In fact, it was at a monthly series that I co-host called Little Theater. And they call it terrible. And I thought that was really interesting. I actually don't remember it as being terrible at all, but I can start with telling you what it was because in a sense, from that germ, I think all the rest of the work springs. And what Poetics at that point was a matrix of non-performers. So they were arrayed in a kind of grid. We usually performed in the traditional stage and audience configuration, but because this was Halloween and because Okwi Opokwasili wanted to do some dance that was going to take the whole floor up and somebody else wanted to use the whole floor, they also wanted to use the whole floor. And I remember that they put a kind of grid out in chalk. They'd drawn a grid. And basically these people all just stood there and repeated various, I wouldn't dignify them by calling them dancerly moves, but did sort of movement things. And this went on for 20 minutes and then it stopped. And I guess because of how much further they've taken this method, they probably look back on it and say it was really terrible, or maybe they were expecting something different from it. But the germ idea that I'm talking about is to, A, start with a bunch of people who are not necessarily performers, although in fact, as you'll see, those of you that have seen the work know that the people that are still often described as non-performers are actually fantastic performers. But they're not relying on a kind of pre-agreed upon codified set of performance skills, and then give them some tasks. Basically just gives them some tasks with a set of rules that go with the tasks and say, you hit start, execute, and then when it's over, it's over. And that's what Poetics was, and now maybe I'll hand over to somebody else on the panel who wants to talk more about how that idea evolved in further elaborations of that piece, because there's now a full-length version of it called
Can I
Choreography?
jump
Yeah.
in
Sure.
for a sec? Poetics was a sort of very pure exercise in Cagean performance-making techniques. I think every element, or nearly every element in Poetics, was determined in rehearsal by roll of the dice.
I think you're right, yes.
Therefore, the next piece, which used a different methodology, came to be called No Dice.
Right.
But it was one of the purest applications that I've ever seen of Cage's theories, methodology. They were so rigorous about it. And it had, I think, exactly effect that Cage imagined. If somebody really did this, it's been applied so often to music and kind of gallery performance, but I don't think anyone has really, maybe since the Michael Kirby days, have really done a sort of purely structuralist piece of theater, certainly not of that length, and certainly nothing as completely entertaining as that turned out to be. So it's interesting that they adopted a very kind of severe methodology, and then after one show abandoned it. But all of the shows, I think, have that kind of underpinning. They have an internal logic that's followed very strongly,
Well,
but that don't necessarily point the way to the next.
I think the thing that the Cagean element that continued even after poetics. So if poetics was decided by chance methodology, and that was the thing that they abandoned, the sort of the, what would you call it, like the Cagean precept that they don't abandon, and that is one of the reasons why they are unlike almost any other company, is the fierceness of the way that they approach listening. And so if Cage's entire project was to change the way that we listen to things, they seem to actually have almost the identical project, which is of finding poetry in trash, of finding cadence in pauses, of finding meter in melodrama. So they have this policy now, which they've transitioned into, of using. I think Kelly actually calls it trash, but it's these verbatim phone conversations, which for I think the 2/3 of us who have seen the stuff, that will come as no surprise. But I do think that is when you look at poetics and when you look at the phone conversation pieces, it seems as though there's nothing in common other than like Anne Gridley's Weird Body in a Leotard. But actually, the thing that they have in common, I think, is that they want us to listen to everything. They want us to listen to the most banal conversation that you might overhear on the subway, and to convert it into something kind of joyous and strange.
So, we should describe, for those who never saw it, these conversation-based pieces like No Dice, the piece that followed Poetics. I always thought, stupidly enough, that it had something to do with like no DJ, because there was so much speaking that goes on in the piece. I thought it had something like it was no dice.
No.
That's simple. But so if they're not working with what aleatory techniques, like chance techniques in performance, then they are. How rigorous, I wonder, and I wonder if anyone knows the answer to this, how rigorously did they rehearse their pieces? Because No Dice is based on a series of phone conversations, various people, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And they've transcribed it, and then the performers, and people might know this already, the performers have the recordings on their iPods, and they all start their iPods at the same time, and they start the performance. And they're speaking the transcribed conversations, or the edited conversations, as they perform various gestures, and using maybe silly voices or wearing eccentric costumes. And the performance lasted for about 4 hours almost?
Well, they play tricks, and they are the best trick players. I've gotten fooled by them 3 times, and I think of myself as like super, super hard bitten, like really like the cans and you can't fool, Mm-hmm. And I have been fooled by them 3 times. The first time was Poetics Ballet Brut, when they took us in the back of the Newman at the Public, and I was convinced, because they took me in a different door, that there was a different theater at the Public that I'd never been in. And even after the beautiful moment at the end, when like the curtain goes up and you can see the whole theater, I was like, yeah, it just does not look like the Newman. It must be a different theater, and had to be like talked to very slowly by Public staff. And then the second time,
We had to go in like through the garbage.
yeah, we had to go
Like
through the garbage cans. I know. I was like, I don't know. Maybe that wine shop has like a surprisingly large theater in it. Who can tell? And then the second time was at Fragments, when and I actually have been a diehard fan of this company, and so I obviously know their customary members, including Zach Oberzant. So I'm sitting in a show that I know is by Nature Theater of Oklahoma. I'm sitting next to Zach Oberzant in the audience, and I turn to him and I say, "Oh, hi. Aren't you usually in their pieces?" you're so wonderful. And he was like, and we had a lovely chat. And then he said, I just have to do one quick thing. And he was an audience plant. Like, that's so rude. And he stood up and started acting. And I was like, good, that's two. And then, so that was embarrassing. And then the third time was what you were just saying about no dice, is the fact that the 4-hour running time is actually kind of a lie.
It's like 3.5.
It's 3.5. There's sandwiches. Like, it's you go into it with this sort of, I will endure the marathon mindset, and so every minute that you get back feels like a gift.
But we gotta, I think, or at least I gotta talk about why it has to be 3.5 hours or whatever it was, or at least my experience of why it has to be 3.5 hours. So for anybody that didn't see the show, I'll just amplify on what David said. There were at least 3 different sets of systems or rules. The first were these phone conversations, taped phone conversations, which the actors were basically voicing because it was coming in over their headsets. The second was a set of poses that looked like the worst kind of theatrical publicity pictures that you see in like a really small town paper where everybody's mugging, like this. And in fact, I read some of the documentation about the piece, and they did, in fact, I think, look at old publicity pictures and stuff. So there was a set of large poses that more or less signified theatrical emotions of various sorts. And then there was a set of really bizarre little hand and arm gestures. And these 3 things were kind of going on at the same time. Again, in the description of the piece, you'll read that in addition to all of that, as if this wasn't enough, they also had designated 13 positions on the stage that the actors could be in, and they had, because there were 4 people in the show, 2 people had to be in different sets of positions at the same time, so that when these people moved here, the others had to move there. And I think there were a couple of other things too. Incidentally, apparently Kelly and Pavel were in the back of the theater as well, directing some of this. So all of this information flowing into the actors' heads. But the question that certainly occurred to me looking at the prospect of a 3-hour piece, and definitely in the first hour or so of this piece, is really the same question that occurs to me every time I looked at a Cage piece or Cage Cunningham piece, which is, I sort of get the system here. What am I really looking at, and why should I be interested in it? Is it really beautiful? Bear with me, there were a couple of Cage pieces that absolutely blew me away. But with Nature Theater, I found that for the first hour and a half, all I was doing was just kind of watching stuff that was interesting enough. And I think that's a key idea. At one point in the interviews, they talk about asking themselves, what's the least that we have to do to make something theater? And that implies 2 things. It says something about the nature of the material, but it also says something about the context in which this material is placed and the transformation that needs to be effected in order to turn something that, by definition, is not theatrical into something that's just theatrical enough. So the material is just interesting enough, and the phone conversations in particular are just interesting enough because they're anecdotal, because they're very familiar, and because they're conversations, and we're listening in on somebody else's conversation, and it's always kind of fun, I mean, you could probably take your kids and put them to sleep. I used to go to sleep listening to ball games. I'll bet you listening to phone conversations would be even better. But after about an hour and a half, something else started to happen, because at that point, the underlying sense that all of this, while it was kind of goofy and nothing really related to each other, that all of this was based on an intricate set of rules, began to become clearer and clearer. And while I couldn't articulate the rules, I began to say, oh, I've seen that hand gesture before. I've seen them do that before. And that was, again, another level of just interesting enough for me to say, oh, I see a kind of structure here. I couldn't have told you what the structure was, but because I'd been immersed in it for so long, and because it was so relentless and merciless, I began to say, okay, yeah, I'm used to this place now. And once I could recognize the structure, it began to be meaningful. And that was a truly mind-blowing moment, because by making me sit through this 2 hours worth of theater and learn their system, which of course is just as arbitrary and meaningless as ballet or lots of other kind of very sophisticated art forms, I began to appreciate the beauty of it without, again, ever adducing any more meaning to the piece in terms of the content, purely in terms of structure. So I think this is one of the things that these guys are onto, and a lot of people have been onto this but I don't think anybody does it quite as elegantly as they do.
And I think they also, there's a lot of pleasure involved in what
Yeah.
they do, because I don't remember the exact structure of it, you know, I did see it a couple times, but at the end of that, at the end of an initial sort of 2-hour period, there's a terrific dance.
Right.
That just, is it Rob Erickson who is also
Yes.
doing the sound?
Yeah.
And he has, what's the machine called that he uses?
Like a looping
A
device. I
looping
don't know.
machine where he was sort of just making crazy noises into the machine and then looping it and then adding layers of sound, so it became this like this goofy sort of like, you know, dance track. And then they all started dancing very
Like
strange.
a Muppet rapping.
Like, and I thought you were describing the dance. How, like Muppets dancing? They were all, I don't know what
Yeah.
the dances were, just
Muppets with
spastic,
legs.
crazy.
Yeah.
And that ended a sort of first part in a way,
Yeah.
I think. And that was just incredibly fun. And Poetics, of course, explodes. And I mean, they're dancing to a bunch of hits like Dreamweaver and ABBA. And then it's about 4 performers doing gestural movements in front of a curtain, you know, smoking, making bunny ears, that kind of thing. And they layer the gestures, they repeat them, they speed them up, they slow them down. And then by the end of the piece, they bring in 30, 40, as many people as will fit in the theater dancing on this huge stage. And you're on the back of the stage looking into the theater. So it's incredibly fun and silly.
So I think like that's another. So if they have a poetics, which seems like how could they have a poetics since they keep making texts out of other people's language? So Kelly is a playwright, and yet they're making pieces out of these long phone conversations, verbatim, and yet they do weirdly manage to have an incredibly identifiable poetics. So one of them, I think, is definitely this interest in the way that other people sound. The other is inclusion. And so they'll often have pieces which have local actors who become a part of it. That's something that we'll see in one of the episodes from Life and Times. And that there is something which is, it's just sloppy enough, like the edges are just frayed enough that you can kind of tie on other people's participation to the outside of whatever they've actually woven. I was just talking to Caleb Hammonds, who's right here, producer, so rep, one of the great minds who bring you this piece here today, and he was saying that that dedication to this to this third thing, this sort of intensity of listening, which is their dedication to kind of old-fashioned storytelling, like everybody's story is interesting, which is kind of deeply humanist, which is a very surprising thing for a group who's so clearly invested in irony at the same time, is that they have the third and fourth pieces, so they're based on what Life and Times is also based on a phone conversation. This one, a single phone or a single set of phone conversations with Kristen Worrell, in which she sort of narrates her life. They don't even have a transcription. So we were saying that their method is recording, then transcription, which turns into text. And for 2 of the episodes, I don't know if this is true for others, I know you said for 3 and 4, they don't even do that. The performers either can listen to recordings or they can read off cue cards, but there is no moment when it goes from being a told story into a written text. So it's kind of Homeric, like it's really, they're passing this one story that may or may not be banal. Kristen Worrell's life, I don't know, I can't judge, I haven't seen it. But it certainly is, sort of has a found element to it, but is still, it's being observed with the same, you will hear the story and pass it on quality that you would about a Homeric hero.
I mean, Kristen Worrell, I mean, just factually, she's a sound designer. She's their sound designer, right? For the show as well, I think. I don't know if she's
You're getting shaken off there.
Is she not the sound designer for the show?
Throw a different pitch. Not true.
Okay. But she's 34 years old. They interviewed her.
Member of the company.
And this tracks her life from birth to not to 34, but to
Not to death.
Not to death, not yet. But because Life in Times, the whole project actually is longer than 4 parts, is it not?
Oh yes.
10.
10
It is
parts.
10 parts. 7 through 10 have not been built.
It's eventually
Just so
gonna
you
be-
know, this is the part where we're getting really, really sure about what we're saying, because Mark and Caleb are giving us the, like,
Actually,
we
it's all
have,
coming in on the
there
little,
are
it's all coming
6
in on.
parts, yes. One of them is a movie, yeah. Yay.
well, yeah,
Radio play?
None of us have seen the show. I mean, I'm seeing it Sunday.
Doesn't slow us down at all.
No.
Literally, we
Let
could
me
be
tell you
here
about it.
for hours.
So yeah, it's going to be a 24-hour event eventually.
You know, one of the things I wanted to say, and I'm going to, is that, and I think this is true of a lot of the ensembles, that ensembles, in a sense, while we tend to talk about the work of the people behind the scenes, the auteurs, the director-writer figures, the experience of the work, rests so much on the individual performers. So to the extent that Worcester Group is Kate Falk, to the extent that Richard Maxwell's company is Jim Fletcher, to the extent that Tina Satter's Half Straddle is Becca and Eliza and Jess and all the others, to me, this company is Anne Gridley, and I don't mean to denigrate the work of the men. I just happen to like looking at women more. But I think that she, to me, really literally embodies a focus which is at the same time totally dedicated and determined and wildly frustrated. And it was funny because when I look at all the pictures that are in the various articles about Nature Theater, in every single one there's a picture of Anne going, you know, and that to me really is the fact that we're watching her have this experience, this repeated experience of going, you know, is, wow, yeah, I can understand that you're having that feeling because you're trapped in this work. And it's very engaging and very humanizing. And I think that there's they're one of the most humanist companies out there, and I don't know why. I mean, maybe it's partly the peanut butter sandwiches, but there just seems to be an awful. You said friendliness, didn't you? Somebody said friendliness to their work.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the obvious question, which is why haven't they been seen here since 2009? And in 2009, they did Romeo and Juliet. Did people here see Romeo and Juliet? Yes, some nods, some smiles, some heartrending cries of despair for those who missed it, which was hilarious. And it was interviews with people, and all they had to do was retell the story of Romeo and Juliet, and like, there's a family named Verona, or something like that, was one line, which just to this day, I'll be on the subway and it will give me a little chuckle. And like the guy who remembers the erotic bath scene, and you're like, what did you watch? Like, what's Cinemax version? God bless him. So,
And the chicken,
or her,
don't forget
or
the
her.
chicken.
And then there's a chicken prompter, giant
Person
chicken
in a
prompter.
chicken suit.
I mean, obviously they're just goonballs. That is one reason why it's so entertaining to watch them. But that was 2009. They built this piece almost entirely overseas, and it is. I think we do have to applaud Under the Radar and Soho Rep for bringing the show here, because I think they have to be the most sort of long-awaited homecoming of any company that I can think of. Really, again, it's that hard-bitten Kansas exterior. I don't usually go to people's websites and kind of moon slightly over where it says, you know, next engagement, and the next 10 are like Rotterdam, you know, Amsterdam, other damn places, and it was never here. So part of it is, when you were saying I don't know what their process is just like it goes on for frickin' ever. Like
Right.
they need a commission which allows them to be in the room with the material for months. And they were given that by Burgtheater, the Viennese Burgtheater. So they have that long tail that comes at the beginning of their work has made them, I think, is one of the reasons why they're such a bunch of humanists, because they have to be so sweet to each other, they can stand each other for that long in the room. And they also, in signing up to be a part of this project, these actors will be part of this project. I mean, it will be years. It will be a decade of their life dedicated to Kristen Worrell's story of her life, and that too. I think we just don't have too many companies with that kind of dedication and its purity. I know that's cheesy, but real purity of purpose.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we should say, if we didn't already, that Poetics was presented by Under the Radar 3 or 4 years ago.
No, longer.
Longer ago.
Longer.
I think 07 or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's when we were, before the economy caught on fire in 2008, Iceland actually invited some critics out to their first international theater festival. And No Dice came out there, and we were invited as well. It was really nice. And I remember asking them at the time, why doesn't Nature Theater present more in New York? And they said they can't afford it.
Yeah.
They can only afford to go to Europe, which is, really unfortunate. And again, yeah, under the radar, and festivals like Coil and others. It's great that they're all happening in January, because for years, we've been complaining that places like BAM or Nigel Redden at Lincoln Center Festival don't do enough homegrown presenting. So they're really filling a void. So it's great. But I don't know the economics of it. I guess, well, you sort of answered it though. Nobody's going to pay for Nature Theater to develop a piece
For a year.
for a year or for 2 months. Let's say they can't give them space. Is that it?
Yes. Am I getting the nod? Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
No one has that. Thank you, Caleb.
It's
It's amazing how much production knowledge I have. It's mostly coming from the column.
The Burke Theater would be like Lincoln Center.
Right.
Commissioning the elevator repair service to work on a piece and paying their salaries all year long.
And
Not
saying,
knowing
don't give us
exactly what
anything
you
till
get.
2015.
Yeah.
Right. Which, great idea, Nigel. Are you out there? Are you listening? Yes. So we are at, does anybody, I think we're actually talking to a group of people here who have all seen at least some of their work. This is actually kind of an opportunity for us to have a room-wide discussion. Are there thoughts, feelings, intentions, purposes? Who can describe the first time? Yes.
Oh, well, but you were about to.
No, I wasn't. It was sort of a prompting, kind of a scooching, goosing
Excuse
thing
me.
I was going to do. Yeah.
Just me.
I just, for people who don't know or haven't heard them, in the last 5 or 6 months, Kelly and Pablo, the co-artistic directors of Nature Theater, have been making a series of podcasts, which are interviews with other artists. They all exist on there's a link on their website. I think it's actually a Tumblr site, but if you go to the Nature Theater website, there's a link to, it's called OK Radio.
Or Soho, I think the Soho Rep, the feed
Soho
site
Rep
also
also
has a
did.
link to OK Radio.
And they're really, they're extraordinary, very intimate, open-ended conversations. Some of them are an hour long, some of them are 2 hours long, with artists primarily across Europe and in New York. I don't think there are too many yet outside of those two categories. The conversations with artists about their lives and their process and how they support their careers, how they support their companies, whether they support companies, and they're really, there hasn't been one that hasn't been absolutely fascinating, whether you know the artists or not. And there were, easily half a dozen artists whose work I don't know in Europe that they spoke with, and the talks were really engaging nonetheless. People tell just enough about their work that you can follow the conversation. And these are becoming an incredible archive, a kind of portrait of both the sort of Western European theater-making community, experimental theater-making community, and also the New York, because I think now they must have interviewed maybe 9 people from New York. Most of them kind of at the center of companies, small experimental companies that make maybe one piece a year that depend on touring. A lot of them depend on touring abroad. I think those are going to turn out to be an amazing document. I think people 50 years from now are going to go back and listen to those the way that we read, some of the ongoing conversations that happened between the Black Mountain group as they aged and as their careers developed and as their work metamorphosed over the years.
One other footnote to this whole discussion of the economic side of it, because I think it's really interesting. I speak as a former theater administrator. But if you look at the copious amount of material that's available on the feed site, Kelly and Pavel talk repeatedly about the economic orientation, the basis of the company. And it involves a number of things. First of all, they wanted to be able to do, they couldn't afford a theater, so they had to do something that was portable, that could be done in any space. They decided very early on that they weren't going to allow, that they basically, because they didn't have enough money to do a show, then they would have to do a show that they could do with the money that they had, and that has informed a lot of the work that they've done. Interestingly, they are one of the rare for-profit theater companies, basically because most of their money comes from touring fees and stuff like that. So they're not 501c3. And the fact that the shows tend to be low-tech, again, is as a reflection of this kind of very firm, original economic bias to do stuff portable and cheap.
I'm always curious, I mean, ephemerality and documentation are always interesting issues. You know, a playwright obviously can publish a play. It can be maybe done by somebody else. A group can mount a work. You know, I mean, if Radio Hole wanted to mount Versed again from 2002, they could do that, maybe. But I really wonder, like 10 years from now, you know, if Nature Theater will just simply be creating more extremely rigorous, ephemeral, you know, work out of found text and conversations, or will they have really completely somehow documented, like say, life and times you know, on video, on film? Like Romeo Castellucci did his Tragedia Endogenida, you know, cycle of 10 plays, 11 plays, and he did a very lavish recording of them on video, and film and video, and you can get like the box set of the DVD. But I just wonder, so I'm just throwing it out there, it's just how they're going to, I don't know, maybe they have really excellent documentation of all their work, I don't know.
Well, they, Caleb, who has slithered out, and I went to Pavel and Kelly's apartment. We had them, Caleb and I curated a festival called Prelude, in which we had some of their video materials. And so we went just to talk about like what they'd be able to give us, and which was mostly just an exercise in watching their incredibly weird and yet needy cats walking around their incredibly beautiful, massive loft apartment. And they do, in fact, they document like crazy. They have just boxes and boxes of stuff, especially because one of the things that they are doing now is they have a, as you can tell from OK Radio, they have a, it's a really voracious appetite to create, and they are making things that are in all the forms. So 1 through 4, we're going to watch things that if we have seen OK theater pieces before, they are somewhat within our expectation of what we will see. There will be looniness, there will be music, there will be jumping, there will probably be inappropriate costumes, there will be overheard text. These things are things that fit inside what we already kind of expect. But episode 5 is a radio play. Because that part of the interview was lost. And so they have to figure out a way to solve that issue. Episode 6, hang on. Nope, that's episode 6. Episode 5 is actually this giant illuminated manuscript, like the Book of Kells or something, and which we saw proofs of and is now finished and will be, I think is going to go, I think Caleb said was going to be, actually Raphael, do you know where it's going to be exhibited? At the Norwich?
It's the Norwich Festival.
Yeah, is the first place, I think, maybe. But this gigantic, extremely beautiful book, which includes a lot of lovingly hand-drawn pornography of Kelly and Pavel's private moments. And also a film component. And if you've looked at if you've seen any of the film experiments they've been doing these very hilarious experiments with stop motion animation. So they have little pieces where it's clear that they were walking around the Burgtheater, we're like, wow, this hallway's really big and has a lot of chairs in it, and then they make this hilarious like little mini movie of them moving the chairs around and and then animating it so it creates like a little snake around the lobby. Just sort of, it just is astounding. They will like if it will hold still long enough, they will make art out of it. And so I think in 10 years, I mean, if these podcasts are sort of the new letters, right? Like they're, that's Rousseau writing down his ideas for what theater should become in order to serve the populace. Like that's really, it's going to be Bell Podcast in the future. I think they are going to be making things that will be consumable in ways that are not just sitting on chairs in a theater. That's my expectation.
So it goes from a theater to an art gallery to a movie theater.
Yeah.
It's going to really...
Yeah, to the privacy of your own home, because the radio show will be, you would listen from their website.
I would also add that all of their sort of short form movies are all on the Center website, as are all of the local radio, so dive in at your leisure. I had a question. This is such a company that builds all of their work in Europe, but they consider themselves to be so Brooklyn-centric and New York-centric. I'm wondering, can you locate them within the world of the Brooklyn theater scene and maybe talk about some of the companies that they consider themselves to be peers of?
That is a Jeff question, definitely.
Well, the Jeff answer would probably be no. The longer answer would be, can I think about that and get back to you? I mean, I don't know. I mean, because it's funny that people would talk about a Brooklyn theater scene, because with the exception of Alec Duffy and a certain large barn on Lafayette Street.
Long Island City, right?
Yeah, I mean, Long Island. Well, that's a whole different thing. That's Queens, for God's sake.
More importantly, I mean, a friend of mine in London just sent me a link to a hilarious Parisian fashion site called C'est très Brooklyn, which if you want
Yes.
to
This is the French
convert
phrase.
your hatred for certain people into a kind of a grudging love, it's a worthwhile site to visit. The Brooklyn school element, it doesn't have anything to do with where they live. It's the fact that they've all gone through the coffee filter, which is Mac Wellman's
Mac
mind.
Wellman, yeah.
Have they really? Have they?
Oh yeah, Kelly graduated from
Kelly?
his
Young Jean,
Young Jean, Sybil Kempson,
Sybil,
everybody in
Thomas
Joyce
Bradshaw.
Cho, Thomas Bradshaw.
Right.
Right. Who else? Aaron
Did
Courtney,
Tina go
Tina
through it?
Satter.
Yeah, that's right.
Lumber Rob.
Yep.
It is actually kind of this amazing
that's true.
hourglass, which is that
So it's
all
the
of these
Brooklyn
important
College School
people
of
have
Theater.
filtered through exactly this one
Yeah.
guy, and the thing that he encourages people to do is he is very interested in trash as art. He gave I think actually the class Kelly was in, he gave them the assignment to take those Burma shave jingles from old what do you call them? You're driving down road signs, exactly, and it's
Nobody's going to know what that is.
Yeah.
It's only old farts like me that
yeah.
remember
So
those.
give us a Burma shave jingle.
I can't remember them, but you drive down the desert and you'd see these little red signs about every 500 feet or
They're
something.
almost like limericks.
Sometimes
Yeah.
it's Burma shave.
Terrible doggerel. Yeah.
Wow.
I've got
Your
one.
face, it has some
Cow
bristles.
crossing, go slow, Joe Wool is some cow's bow.
And it's a series of different road signs down the road.
Right,
Yeah,
each
right,
line.
yeah.
One at a time, yeah,
Right.
like 4 or 5.
And they had to turn the Burma shave jingles
Cow
into.
crossing, go slow, that old cow is, that old wool is some cow's bow.
Some cow's bow.
Oh, Midwest. So they had to convert that into drama. They have a kind of, that's already happening. He also puts a great premium on this overheard process. So two of the people in the audience today have done an exercise that I learned from Mac Wellman, which is he sends you out into the wide world. I learned this at a pataphysics workshop. And I don't know where he got it, but it was first you write a wordless scene. So I did one where paintings are hanging next to each other in a gallery, and some vines grow up over them, something like that. And then you go out and you eavesdrop, and you listen to some, and then you try to copy down verbatim what is happening. And so if you sit, for instance, on the Staten Island ferry, you will hear it all. And then you come into the workshop and you trade with the people next to you, and you wind up with something which is a wordless scene and a series of words that, when you put them together, make inevitably alarming, funny piece of weirdo drama. And I don't know if their interest in verbatim work comes from that exercise, if it works the other way, or if it's a case of, you know, Leibniz and Newton coming up with the calculus at the same time. But it is very much, that to me is a color that I associate with what we think of as the Brooklyn School.
I think there's also a kind of overlapping circle in that Pavel went through Anne Bogart's program at
Right.
Columbia, and along with Rachel Chapkin, and you know, there are other directors who come out of that program and almost immediately form their own companies here in New York.
Yeah.
That's another kind of overlapping circle of colleagues.
Right.
And also
Right.
in the early mid-90s, I guess Pavel must have been in his 20s. I think, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I think he was going to Dartmouth. He comes from Slovakia?
Yeah.
Or Slovenia.
Slovenia?
Slovakia.
Slovakia. And I believe he was going to
Racist.
Dartmouth College, and at some point he was in New York in his 20s, and he did one of the 7-minute series or blueprint series at the Ontological early on when Sophie Haviland was running it,
Yeah.
and when Foreman was still in residence. And I don't know how much he was influenced by Foreman. I don't think he ever worked on any of his shows.
Yes, he was a dwarf.
He was a dwarf.
Yes.
He
Okay.
wanted the shows, and he assisted Richard on another show, and they have a very close personal
Right.
relationship.
So I think that
In
maybe,
fact, there's one of the most fascinating interviews is with Richard Foreman in the
Okay, ready.
podcast series.
okay, well,
About how very connected Pavel still feels to Richard, although they don't, you know, they see each other once a year or whatever, but it's
yeah.
very deeply influenced.
As a next dwarf from Pearls for Pigs, I should know him. Bounce on the International Society of Foreman Dwarfs.
Internet, yeah.
But
But
again, there's another kind of overlapping
Yeah.
circle, because I think that ontological space was also an incubator for, you know, a certain scene of young companies that were getting off the ground at a certain time when Richard was very directly involved in watching and talking with them and kind of mentoring people, and that's another, you know, kind of, I think, community of colleagues that still exists, although the space is different.
and also that would give, you know, Pavel a first-hand experience and respect for like rigorously applying a sort of a very personal set of aesthetics to possibly trivial and random seeming activities. I mean, you know, Foreman will spend a full day of rehearsal choreographing the silliest business, or superficially, like, you know, all right, run through with the mirror, you know, point it at that actor, and then turn around 3 times and fall down. You know, you touch the desk and it has an electric shock. You know, all this, and then he'll just wipe it away and just create something new. I mean, it works like a painter, you know, choreographing just minutia, very rigorously, very precisely, and then wiping it away and redrawing it, and until something clicks, and he's like, he has it choreographed exactly the way it needs to be.
To answer, or at least this is just a theory, but it occurred to me thinking about your question that one thing that may distinguish the Brooklyn artists from, say, the generation that came before is that because Mac isn't connected with a theater company and isn't fundamentally a theater practitioner, he's a writer and a theorist, and his interests extend far beyond dramatic literature, obviously, this group of artists aren't as clearly the epigones of some previous group. So there was a whole generation of Mock Worcesters, there was a whole generation, less of a generation of Foremans and Wilsons and so forth. But these guys, I think, don't have the same kind of clear antecedents in the theatrical community. They have more shared interests and shared methodologies and maybe shared books, but not. So that allows for the diversity that I think is characteristic of what's going on right now.
Are there any questions from the audience at this juncture?
Hi.
Actually wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit. Was something that you were saying, Helen, about how fundamental listening is to OK Theater's process. Because I actually, you know, having just kind of approached it from the outside, not knowing them, not knowing their process, and just seeing their performances, I would have said that they were much more about appropriation. And I think of listening as something that happens in context and something that happens in a way that has to do with the fidelity to the thing one is listening to. Whereas like Romeo and Juliet is like 5 layers of appropriation, right? It's never the authentic thing, it's never the thing itself. And they actually would sort of take the inflection and the voice out of the words that they heard and kind of put their own cadence on it, even if they kept every single syllable of what was said. There was a way in which it was actually evacuated of the sort of specificity of the individual on that level, right? And so, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just kind of flips around the way you think about their ethic.
Well, I think that when I think about them as a hearing company, they are hearing, part of it is just that they try to make such a smooth conduit between what they're hearing and what you're hearing. You're right that they put their own cadences on it, or these crazy accents, which is actually also something that sounds like Grandpa Foreman. You know, the number of times you've listened to something in a Foreman play with a different ear because you are, because they've decided to do it in like crazy accent. Is that actually? I mean, I think that you can't make a piece without hearing. Obviously, there's no anti-hearing theater. Except for anything by John Zorn, in which case you lose your hearing in the first 20 minutes. But is that you have these people who are at the same time messing with your sense of hearing by saying, you heard a phone conversation just like this and you didn't notice. We're going to make you notice, make you notice, make you notice, make you notice, make you notice. And they draw that experience of noticing out so that the next time you hear a thing, a banal thing or a silly story, your sensation of listening is different. And I think that's sort of, if John Berger talks about ways of seeing, they're thinking of ways of listening and paying attention to things which are not particularly honoring a source, that there isn't some kind of slavish reaction to what they're hearing, but they are definitely paying attention to it in a way that all of the rest of us would just let it slip away.
They also, in a lot of pieces, work to make the voice of the living actor as inauthentic as possible, which is really interesting, and again works contrary to standard theatrical practice, where the voice is supposed to be the expression of the soul, it's supposed to be transparent, it's supposed to be expressive. You're always aware that this voice isn't really, well, then it gets complicated. So who is speaking? But it's not an honest character's voice, I should say.
But even as you said though earlier, that Anne becomes that funny gesture, right? Like, so that becomes Anne in a way. Like, there's this weird, I'm just saying that there's a strange way in which authenticity, I mean, I'm not saying that authenticity has to do with merely kind of verisimilitude, but I think that, like, say, Romeo and Juliet is very much about kind of exploring something other than Romeo and Juliet. And I think that they're exploring something other than those phone conversations as well.
Although, that's a very interesting point. Although I think in No Dice they did eventually, after all the 3.5 or whatever hours of artifice and filtering and distorting and maybe even repeating, I should remember better, I think they did actually put the voice in of at least somebody's mother talking about it.
Yeah, they played one at the end.
Yeah, it's like they brought in...
She talks about dinner theater.
Yeah, she went to see some dinner theater. And that's sort of like is interesting, it sort of brings in the thing itself.
With subtitles.
With
Yeah.
subtitles, you know. And so that's kind of interesting, because then the source itself just became another element, another component.
We have to let you go. It's 7 o'clock, and
Yeah.
so we should bid you farewell.
This is the first in the series. On next Wednesday, we are looking at The Everyman in Culture with Julie Burstein, who is the host of Studio 360 and some very special guests. And then on the 29th, we are looking at, we're doing marathon theater with Jonathan Cowell, who's a professor, who's going to talk about how Life and Times is part of this larger idea of long-haul theater.
He's written a book.
Which is great.
Want to look for it.
Episode 1 starts tonight. Tickets are available. Trot across the street, buy some tickets. And thank you, Jeffrey, Helen, and David. And thank you.
Thanks, everyone.